I think humanity has advanced over the generations, and this phase of evolution includes a greater awareness of self-empathy. And the self-empathy attunement that we're seeing right now is revealing profound distress. The pandemic was a collective trauma that we all lived through, and the willingness of people to seek mental health treatment because of the pandemic shifted and increased by enormous amounts. It put such burden on mental health systems unable to meet the demand, and it was really because everybody now knew what trauma was.
Welcome to Season 13 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. I want to thank you for watching, enjoy the show, and if you haven't already picked up a copy, I invite you to do so. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I am joined by Dr. Leanne Gray, who is a psychologist, educator, and the author of Educational Trauma: Examples from Testing to the School to Prison Pipeline. She is certified in EMDR, which is a form of trauma treatment, and is a national speaker on topics of self-compassion, mindfulness, mindful awareness, I should say, LGBTQ plus youth, gender, sexuality, assessment, special education, and gifted individuals. She is also the author of Self-Compassion for Teens and LGBTQ plus youth, and is a contributing author to Pedagogies of Kindness and Respect, in which she discusses educational trauma and empathic education for a compassionate nation. After teaching at UCLA, she is currently in private practice, having resumed clinical work after the pandemic. Welcome to the show, Leanne.
Delighted to be here, and thank you for everything you do to promote empathy.
It's interesting because, well, thank you. So I knew as soon as I came across your work, it must have been through a piece that you had written that I wanted to do this interview. And we're taping it in September, but it's only coming out in a couple of months, which will be sort of not quite the midway point for most parents and students, but close to, like, maybe a third of the way of an academic school year. And I'm hoping that our conversation is actually going to be very helpful for students, for parents, for educators at all these different levels, to talk about what it means to be kind to ourselves, kind to each other, how important mindfulness is, so that we don't end up in these toxic environments that are full of trauma. Because I'll just share at the offset, as a parent, my daughter's in grade 2, and there was a new teacher at her school. And immediately, like day one, on a Facebook group with all the parents in my daughter's grade, there was feedback about this teacher because some children came home really upset about her. And I'll tell you, I had incredibly mixed feelings about this. First of all, I'm an educator, and I try very hard to lead and co-create an anti-oppressive space for learning and for well-being. And I've been teaching for 12 years. I feel very proud of the work that me and my students do together to create this safe and brave space. So part of me as an educator is like, gosh, you have to trust the professional skills of a teacher, and let's not like jump on this new teacher the first day of class and assume the worst. Let's not pile on her. So I was fraught with these feelings, and maybe wondering, like, kids coming back from the school, like from the summer, readjusting, maybe there needed to be a little bit of kind of behavioral management in the classroom, and maybe like kids kind of like were overreacting. That was part of me. The other part is, like, I know these parents, and they're talking about their kids coming home crying. And of course, if my kid came home crying, I'd be like, there's something going wrong. Anyways, after several days, we found out that there were problems in other grades, and the teacher was let go like within the first week of class. So there was obviously something wrong. So I've been dying to have this conversation with you in light of that as a backdrop, because I feel that there's a lot of tensions that need to be teased out between developing resilient children and also having classrooms that are trauma-free. And so I guess, like, let's unpack things one at a time, get there when we get there, but that's on my mind. So what do you think, as a first question, Thank you for listening. It's a lot. And I'm sure is there a lot you want to say right off the bat, or do you want me to wait till it naturally unfolds?
I mean, sure, there's a lot to say. Sure.
Okay, go for it.
But we can unfold more if you'd like. I'm here listening.
Well, okay, maybe just because I'm sure there are going to be listeners and watchers that are going to say, like, shut up, Anita, let the lady speak. Let the expert speak, Okay, what do you say to all of that just initially?
I mean, I think it's an idealistic goal to have an anti-oppressive environment in the classroom and for a classroom to be trauma-free. Idealistic. But it's not the reality. The reality is that classrooms and environments, businesses, communities, and families do include some levels of trauma. And I'd be very curious, naturally, to find out what happened with this teacher for them to be released so soon after the year began. But it doesn't surprise me. Among the things that I found as I discovered the concept of educational trauma is that it's an inadvertent and unintentional perpetration and perpetuation of harm in schools. And I found that there was a spectrum of unintentional harm that gets perpetrated and perpetuated. On the mildest end, we have anxiety. On the more severe end, in the States, we see the school to prison pipeline. Here in Canada, I think it's what happened with the Indigenous children in residential schools. But at the end of the day, the pedagogy is suffused with white supremacy. And there's inherent trauma and inherent damage that's being done. In the mid-range of the spectrum, there's teacher abuse. And when I was writing my book, I interviewed some teachers to ask them what their thoughts were about teacher abuse. And it fascinated me that each teacher had a different perspective on what that looked like. I thought it was the teachers being abused by the systems, by the rules, by the lack of freedom in the United States around their ability to practice the pedagogy they're trained in and expert in. But they saw it as literally physical abuse by students. They saw it as the abuse that they received from the parents. And so I think that your child's second grade experience with that teacher may have involved some abuse by the teacher to result in such a swift release from the position. Of course, I'm speculating, I don't know, but we're thinking about what could have happened. And because it's so swift, it had to have been something that was egregious and obvious. And that's where abuse of children can be.
Yeah,
and also bullying. Right?
I certainly don't want to speak too much about this particular case to respect privacy and also, my daughter's school and all of that. But I think you've already opened up so many really wonderful ways to carry the conversation on. So trauma in education can happen in many different ways, right? So children can feel trauma in the classroom in many different ways, and each student experiences it like the same circumstance differently based on what their home environment is or what their own personality is or the day of the week it is, right? So there's the children. Then there's the parents. I think it's really probably a valid thing to talk about that maybe is not spoken about enough in parent culture, that, it's a painful experience as a teacher who's well-meaning to have parents, piling on, making assumptions based on stories that are being told at home that may or may not be exaggerated or truthful. And then, of course, there's sort of administrative power structures that could also be abusive. So where to start here? Oh my gosh, where do we begin? Yeah.
Right. Well, you're noticing the confluence of tensions between parents as holders of power, certainly in private schools where they pay tuition, parents as collaborators who are invited and expected by teachers to play a role in their child's education. And then, of course, the other power variable, which would be the administrators, the systems and the rules of each school or school district. So where do we begin with all that? Well, I think there's some confusion actually about what education is. I think there's a lot of confusion. I think it's infused, as I said before, with white supremacy. There are rules that infuse how children are educated. There's a lot of pressure placed on them. You brought up behavior management. Like, what is that at the end of the day? It's control of a child's behavior. Reminds me of Freire's, the banking model of education, where children receive this gift bestowed upon them, deposits from the teacher. So that power differential, it exists between parents and their children, between parents and teacher in both directions, so between administration and the teachers. But at the end of the day, every time that power differential is reinforced, we're teaching children how to conform and comply for their futures. And when they're conforming and complying and upholding systems that are oppressive, then all we're doing is we're training people in how to be a part of and uphold systems that discriminate and marginalize. Is this too soon to jump into what do we do about it? Because I could talk about the problem forever.
Well, I actually do. I mean, I really do. I mean, who knows? We had prepared questions and now here we are off script and I love it. I love it. So, so what would you say? I mean, I think it also differs depending on what age we're talking about and what tier of education. But let's talk a little bit about the elementary school, primary school. What would I don't know what word to ascribe, what adjective, what would a beautiful educational experience look like?
Yeah. So when I was thinking about educational trauma, I was thinking equally about what the solutions could be, because there's so many books and presentations and discussions about what the problems are, but we need solutions. And I was heavily influenced by democratic educational models like the Sudbury School in the US. And it's a model of education that places students, even in the primary grades, at an equal level of responsibility. It endeavors to dissolve those power differentials. So the students have a role in hiring, they have a role in running the school. And the point of these democratic schools is to teach them how to be active participants in a democracy at a very young age. And so there's no structured curriculum, which is really uncomfortable for a lot of professionals and parents. But at the end of the day, when we give children the freedom to decide how to spend their time, when we give them the freedom to pursue their passions, they actually learn a lot more and they retain a lot more. So there's a lot of data, and I think it's anecdotal. I haven't really looked at the objective data, to be honest with you, but there's a lot of examples and stories about how students are very successful coming out of these schools, but they struggle in some communities to stay afloat because they are different from what the expected model of education is. In 2014 to 2019, my nonprofit organization, the Connect Group, experimented with this model, but we adapted it somewhat. We included design thinking in it. But here's the thing. We didn't just include design thinking, because that's in schools all over the United States. I'm not sure about Canada, but it's all over the United States. What we did was we made design thinking the way the students created the school and designed their own learning programs. Typically, design thinking is about solving a human-centered problem for another person. But if we think about Paul Bloom, a psychologist at Yale, his book on Against Empathy, we can see that empathy is a bit slippery. It can lead to immorality, decisions that are actually quite cruel. And instead, he argues for compassion. And as to our discussion just before we began on IDG and how to look at internal change, I think that self-empathy is the future here, not just empathy for other people, but it's that one side of the coin where we look at what are our needs and what is our experience, and we design for ourselves going forward. Because the idea of design thinking actually upholds power differentials. It says the designer knows best for the person that they're solving for, and that the person they're solving for is at the behest and mercy of the designer. And this was actually a really radical idea at the time. It was a very unusual spin on design thinking and to use it. But the students that have come out of that experiment, we didn't take it any further than experiment for a few years, are actually thriving and doing really well.
So what do you say to the naysayers that are like, well, we are in a very competitive world where there are students coming from all across the globe, coming into our universities, and we want our children to be academically strong and all, do all of the extra co-curricular stuff that's required. And now the idea that you're suggesting is, well, why don't we teach them to be great citizens and to flourish as individuals despite whatever the superstructure is? So what do you say to the critics about that? Because, they're well-meaning parents that probably just want their kids to get a job.
I say two things. First is I say, look at the mental health data and the rates of suicide. I think suicide is the number 3 killer in adolescents in the United States, and mental health concerns for students in Canada and the US has skyrocketed. I recently read a piece on how University of Toronto is not adequately serving the psychological needs of their students. So the kids are suffering and they're breaking down. In the States, they're not making it through college if they get into college. So, okay, you want a superstar? Great. I'd rather have a child that is healthy and balanced, regardless of what their occupation is or their earning power. But at the end of the day, the identity leadership in society, but specifically in organizations, corporations, and schools, is the way that these maladaptive ideas are perpetuated. And it brings to mind the work of Alice Miller, Poisonous Pedagogies. The ideas about education have been distilled and euphemized over time, passed down generation from generation, as if they are helpful when in fact they do harm. And so an example of that would be in the States when students are like primary school kindergartners, they have to bring bulletproof backpacks and they have to do active shooter drills. And so we look at that as it's for their own protection. It's for their best interest. That's what identity leadership is. It promotes these in-group ideas and values that are actually in other settings quite unconscionable. And so in what world is it even appropriate to be teaching children how to manage active shooters and such dangerous experiences? Well, in the US, that's completely normal because that's how the United States has chosen to deal with those things.
I guess the same thing could be said about the world that the children are inheriting vis-a-vis climate change, right? And the eco-anxiety that they're facing.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really problematic time to be growing up. There's a lot of existential dread in our children, even the young ones. And we saw this at the earliest time in the early 90s when student shooters in the United States were coming out, and they tended to be white, disgruntled boys who had learned that solving problems happened with guns. So there's something about the culture that's really infected, and the solutions for managing that infection is so problematic as to leave people mentally ill in wide numbers.
So would it be fair to say that what I'm hearing so far from the conversation is, okay, you're a proponent of alternative forms of education that are not like what the system currently has? So you've had an example that you just talked about in the co-created curriculum, the design with the students, the democratic sort of models. Would you also say, as important as if your child is in the system of education, as it is the status quo system, that in order to flourish, despite all of the dysfunctions and traumas, that the key skill to develop is the self-compassion and is the self-empathy? Would you say that those are two really important things to you?
I would say they are, because at the end of the day, a really nice attunement with self will help people of all ages make decisions that are best for them.
So what does that look like? Okay, you just said an interesting word. I know what attunement means, but for those who are listening and hearing it for the first time, what is self-compassion? What is self-empathy? What is attunement? Teach us.
So empathy has been defined a number of different ways over time. Some people will say it's putting yourself in someone else's shoes, or the golden rule, treat other people as you would want them to treat you. And those are actually misappropriations. They're mischaracterizations. In fact, the platinum rule is to treat people as they want to be treated. And the ultimate form of empathy is to listen to people and be curious to learn more about them, not to presume one knows. Similarly, self-empathy is about getting curious about oneself with a non-judgmental stance, with an embrace, with an acceptance, with grace and kindness, with forgiveness. And then from that, once one is able to step into oneself and really peer in and identify what their needs are, what their dislikes are, what their feelings are, then they can act from a place of compassion. Compassion is defined at Stanford University Center for Compassion, Altruism, Research, and Education as the ability to identify suffering and the willingness to act to relieve that suffering. That's other focused compassion. When compassion is focused inward, it actually has a bit of a different definition. It has 4 different domains, one being mindful awareness, paying attention to what's happening with open, balanced awareness. Number 2 would be self-kindness, self-acceptance, loving awareness and acceptance of the self. Number 3 would be shared humanity or interconnection. That's the awareness that we are all linked. What you do affects me, what I do affects you, what we do affects people we don't know, we don't see. And then finally, if self-compassion truly embraces the heart of compassion, it includes the willingness to act to relieve suffering. People can address their own suffering by making specific choices for themselves. If they have an attunement to themselves, empathy for themselves, an understanding of what's going on. And I think educational systems and corporations show people to ignore that in service of mission, profit. The greater good for all is defined by perhaps menacing policies and laws.
So what are some of the practices that you think children can adopt to sort of, if you're a parent listening and you're like, okay, I want to start doing this practice with my child, what would that look like?
So interestingly, we know that the research shows that when one person in the family practices self-compassion, it affects all others. And the work of Daniel Siegel at UCLA shows that, called, I think, The Mindful Parent, shows that parents would best serve their children by dealing with their problems, resolving their childhood traumas, wounds, hurts, lack of attunement, attachment problems, and wounds. So really, if one parent started to practice self-compassion quietly and silently, it would affect the whole family in ways that are a little bit hard to presume and predict. But we know that it has validity in the research. I think it's important to expose children to social emotional learning, social emotional instruction. Despite the flaws in design thinking that I described earlier, I think it's a really robust way to structure education. So we're getting now away from individual and family solutions and more to pedagogical shifts that are fairly significant. But at the end of the day, some mindfulness is a really beautiful way to start. And with children, it can be really challenging to introduce mindfulness. There's been a lot of work done by Susan Kaiser Greenland with the inner kids. It's just about getting creative and showing them how to pay attention without any expectations. Maybe just paying attention to the ways in which they're feeling restless, sad, anxious, and then from there moving to coping skills.
I want to talk also about teachers, but first, as I'm listening to you, we're both authors, and I've heard somewhere along the lines, I heard a lot of quotes about book writing while I was writing the book. And one of them was, we write the book we need to read. I wonder if the work that you do, because I mean, obviously you're speaking like a credible authority on this, and you've spent, many, many years looking at educational trauma, writing about it, and you have some strong opinions about it. I wonder if there are any personal stories that you'd be willing to talk about that sort of is the backstory behind your passion for this space.
Sure. I did a lot of expert witness work when I was an early career psychologist. So when schools and parents had disagreements about what a child's best education would look like, they would bring me in to do a psychodiagnostic assessment on the child, and it would eventually end up in court. I spent a lot of time around teachers, and I was struck when one teacher said to me that she didn't believe in the standardized tests she was administering, but she was just doing her job. Mm-hmm. And as a second generation survivor of the Holocaust, I knew I had heard those words before. That there were people who were very well-intended and well-meaning people who showed up to their job every day, but they were also very much a part of sustaining the Holocaust and seeing millions and millions of people perish. So if educators are just doing their job, but they don't agree with it, that's the book that I needed to read. I needed to understand why an educator could say that. And it was a devastating and life-altering experience to do this research and to live this challenge for about 15 years.
Right. And what to do with that information, because I don't know, I would estimate that most teachers don't believe in standardized testing. I believe that most teachers understand that the nature of each flower is to bloom in their own way. The best teachers that we all have recognize some innate gifts and like encouraged us to pursue them. So how do we attract teachers given the system is what it is? Like, I mean, it's all at the policy level, and then unions, and then the old guard versus the new. Like, I mean, it seems like a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it feels like a massive undertaking. And I often felt like David against Goliath. And I think to those teachers, we say, please pay attention to identity leadership and what it is.
So tell us, what is identity leadership?
Identity leadership is the way in which a representative or a leader promotes certain ideas about shared value and in-group dynamics that trickle down as if they have the best interest of the parties at heart, when in fact they might be unconscionable in other places. So identity leadership is similar to poisonous pedagogies, but outside of education. And I've brought it into education to explain how poisonous pedagogies flourish. So if we think about needing standardized testing to prove, to submit evidence that students are learning adequately to receive dollars, then the shared group value that promotes worthiness around these practices is we need students to perform well on tests so we could fund the school. And around that, certain practices are promoted despite the fact that they're unconscionable.
Hi there. At the risk of interrupting this great conversation, I just want to draw your attention to two things. There's over 150 episodes on the Purposeful Empathy channel. You may want to check them out, and I would invite you to press the subscribe button so that you get them into your mailbox every week so you don't miss a show. Thanks so much for watching. Without any ad spend or SEO, we have over 25,000 organic views. I want to thank you so much for watching. Again, hit the subscribe button. The world needs more empathy, and you have a role to play. So what are we to do then as parents who are sending our kids to schools? And in this imperfect scenario, I mean, you know, obviously in the best case scenario, it'd be like, let's take our children out and put them into these like other alternative methods of education. That's not available to everybody. Okay. So what do you do? What can parents do?
Recognizing that each child, family, parent, and community has unique needs. And with mindful awareness, compassion, self-compassion, trying to make the best decision for their kids. Some teachers, some families are accepting the status quo because it's quote good enough. I would challenge them to not accept good enough for their children or themselves, and to find something that truly fits. And it's an ideology busting concept, right? It goes against the grain of everything we've learned and taught.
So how do you manage the tension between advocating on behalf of the children for a more emancipated education, a less banking, less traumatic educational model, and not feeling like you're piling on to the teachers who are just doing their jobs under those conditions? Like, how do you resolve that tension?
In the definition of educational trauma, I was very careful to include the words inadvertent and unintentional. That's how I manage that tension. I say it's not something that anybody specifically intends, but everybody participates in upholding when they access those type of schools and programs. So then really hard problem, you know, I don't think I manage it very well, advocating for the students and recognizing the status quo. It breaks my heart and leaves me discouraged every day.
But do you think the drumbeat of parents writing to the administration and writing to the parents is a good one, or that creates like an us versus them scenario?
I think it's a sign of the friction. It's the friction that exists in both parties, because the system itself is not serving the greatest good for all. It's serving some supremacy that is not always evident.
Incredible. Wow, this is so much food for thought.
Ugh, it's so depressing, so demoralizing,
Hmm?
so demoralizing.
Yeah, but I think it speaks to, I mean, education being a very big part of everybody's life, because we all, by law, have to go
Yes.
through it. But there are so many other systems of repression that also cause trauma, which is why we're all walking around like the wounded, all the, psychologically wounded.
I think humanity has advanced over the generations, and this phase of evolution includes a greater awareness of self-empathy, and the self-empathy attunement that we're seeing right now is revealing profound distress. The pandemic was a collective trauma that we all lived through, and the willingness of people to seek mental health treatment because of the pandemic shifted and increased by enormous amounts. It put such burden on mental health systems unable to meet the demand. And it was really because everybody now knew what trauma was. Prior, not so much.
Right. And where do you stand on the whole issue of how children have fared, given the interest in protecting large swaths of society against this virus and keeping kids at home, and now realizing that was just very, very painful for children too?
Right. I think it shows the tenuousness of the learning paradigm and the pedagogies that we have right now, that without sustained practice and intervention, there was an inevitable slide back. And I think that there are more appropriate learning pedagogies and systems that wouldn't have that same kind of slide. But it was about taking away the structure that people knew about education, parenting, daycare even, and leaving people to their own devices. And it's threatening and it's terrifying. And parents don't want to be in situations where they don't know what to do. And that's what closing schools for the greater good and the protection of health and safety of the public left parents. But the truth of the matter is that we all think that we know to some degree. We rely on each other and experts, and I'm not really sure we do. And that's where meditation, mindful awareness, compassion, self-compassion, empathy, and self-empathy come in as guideposts to discern and discriminate and differentiate what is best for each individual from their unique perspective.
So what is your favorite practice? What do you deploy as an individual for dealing with whatever's going on in your life?
So my favorite practice is the loving kindness meditation. In the Pali language, it's called metta, METTA, and it translates back to English as friendly wishes. So when I was struggling with the realizations of educational trauma, I practiced loving kindness for myself, sent myself friendly wishes every single day for a long time. And then my practice evolved. It's a multi-step practice where you start with yourself and then you extend it to other people beyond yourself. And then I expanded my practice to other people, and it's left me in a place of surrender right now, acceptance. I surrender and I accept what is. I don't like it. I don't bless it. I don't condone it, not one bit. And I have actually found that working one-on-one with people is I feel a little bit more effective than when I was trying to address systemic problems.
What about teens? Let's talk a little bit about teens. You spent more time in the elementary school. I think social media is a crisis for teens. And they are learning. It's a space for learning. They're learning about their worlds, their lives, themselves, their friends, the future in that space. What advice would you offer teenagers or the parents of teenagers to cope with all of those hardships?
Right. Good question. Good question. So I think that the problem is not actually social media, but rather social media is the lens through which we can see the problem. Some families are very, very concerned about how they're perceived and how they and their children look. Those are the families that are going to see far more impact of social media, the competition, the comparison, and the resulting depression that comes from that constant comparison. I think the families and the students that have an understanding of themselves, their authentic strengths and abilities, a willingness to be vulnerable and see the parts of themselves that aren't perfect, are able to take it and leave it as information.
So again, that goes to like, the wholeness of somebody who feels a bit healed as parents. Yeah, okay. Huh.
Huh. I'm from a lot of disparate places, and it's really complicated. But at the end of the day, we're living through times that are apocalyptic. And social media shows us how bad the apocalypse is. And it's going to differ from person to person to understand what they're seeing in social media. Some are going to see it as a reflection of their own vulnerability and inadequacy. Others are going to see through social media the breakdown of society. Yet others are going to see the way that the climate is changing to the peril of humanity. So it depends on the perspective of each individual. And we can't really know what each person's perspective is until they tell us.
So what drew you back to clinical practice? You've moved from the States back to Canada. Now you're working one-on-one with clients again. So how's that going and why?
So I was training and traveling all over the United States for many years. And when the pandemic came, I was supposed to do a double speaking tour in Australia and to go to 8 different cities. And it just came to a grinding halt. So the business of speaking, training, and traveling ended, and I couldn't sit around bored out of my mind. So the next thing that was available to me was clinical practice, and doing it online has proven to be such a blessing and a rewarding experience. I would never have thought I would wind up in telehealth. It's not something we were trained to do. I saw lots of drawbacks, and none of them materialized. It has really provided a lot of access, a lot of intimacy. I get to see people's homes, their family members, especially the pets. The pets get involved in the therapy all the time. And these are very revealing things about people that I couldn't see in my office.
Mm-hmm.
So I thank the pandemic. It caused me to pivot in a way that I never thought I'd go back to clinical practice, but I'm really glad that I did, because I now understood people's problems from a very multi-layered perspective. And it allowed me to come to the clinical setting with more equanimity, more balance, more strength, as a result of having witnessed the challenges in society at the individual, family, social, community, and global levels.
Okay, so I have just a couple more questions and then say thank you. This has been such a really dense conversation. Really, no, dense and all dense as in like meaty, like full of stuff. I mentioned teachers earlier. I think I want to circle back to them because you said you interviewed them and they mentioned this thing. Well, I don't want to administer the test, but I have no choice, right? And then we kind of moved somewhere else. What advice have you got for teachers to take care of themselves? Because it's not easy right now.
It's the same advice. Practice meditation, practice self-compassion. There are beautiful retreats for teachers around these topics of like workplace trauma, right? Secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout. Susan Kaiser Greenland, who has really innovated our practices for introducing mindful awareness to kids, led a beautiful retreat for educators, delving into self-healing. It's the same thing at the end of the day.
The same thing. It's interesting because I just got contacted by somebody out in Alberta about first responders also needing self-empathy. Of course they do. Okay, I want to read something back to you that you shared with me. Sure. You wrote, there are many ways to increase empathy and self-compassion, including formal and informal practices and reimagining education and leadership to focus more directly on the cultivation of social emotional skills. And then you also wrote, and this is what I really want to drill down on, challenging social conventions that are harmful yet perpetuated as helpful. So how do we do that? What are the ways in which we can do that?
We know what we know, recognize what's obvious. So homework is problematic for families and students. It provides additional stressors. The extracurricular activities that are required for a student to stand out in their university applications, it needs to be reframed as things that people do because they want to do them, not because of this goal of getting accepted later on in their, early adult years, late adolescent years. recognizing the actual harms. Active shooter drills are not helpful. The kids come out of that completely traumatized. They don't come out of it feeling empowered. Now they know how to deal with it. Let's know what we know.
Yeah, I've actually discovered that from my own teaching, that one of the things I'm starting to notice, all the mental health issues are seeping in. They're super well connected, but they don't feel a sense of belonging. There's a little example of, first day of class. And I've talked about this before. I gradually changed what I do. And now what I do in class is the boldest of the bold, where I have a set of letters on the screen. This is on the first day of class. They're meeting me for the first time, and I'm meeting them. And it's a set of letters. And when the next slide shows up, they're unjumbled into a full sentence. Okay. And I give them a minute to sort of tease out what that sentence can be. And it's not enough time because, it's just not enough time, but they're in the mood to compete and they take it seriously if there's a competition. So then the reveal is, you are better than you think you are. Not you're better than anyone else. You are better than you think you are. And it was something that a mentor told me, for years as he was mentoring me. And I started initially the practice with just doing the reveal. And now the bold is I actually go to every student and I get down to eye level with them. And I say it to them, each and every one of them, on the first day of class and then on the last day of class. And I find it really striking how many students are moved to tears. Mm. And it makes me wonder, why a sentence like that would be so powerful. I have lots of theories about that. What I think I've noticed over the last decade of teaching is that students don't have a sense of agency. It's like they feel like they're beholden to a situation where they don't actually have the capacity to be agents of change. So I want to talk a little bit more about this project that you worked on. Could you elaborate more on what the curriculum was like and the takeaways?
So at the Connect Group School, or the model that we experimented with, empathic education for a compassionate nation, we promoted the advocacy and agency in the students by making them designers of their own lives, designers of their own curriculum. There wasn't a curriculum. That's what we drew from the democratic schools. So we provided them with all the options. You want to learn art? We're going to give you art teachers. We're going to give you art field trips, whatever. We're going to give you art supplies, whatever you want, you're going to get it. It's obviously, it can't be scaled very easily. We had a very small cohort, but we also invited them to participate in the inception of the educational model. We took the students to teach empathy circles to the mayor of San Diego's Joint Commission of Youth and Gang Prevention. So we took them into the community, and we actually empowered them with agency. What I want to connect with your question about the model and agency and the statement that you provided to your students on the first day with the letters that shift is, when it's a really lovely message to say you are better than you think you are, right? It has intrapersonal competition instead of interpersonal competition. But it reifies the stratification of society. There's good, better, and best. Mm. I hope that you'll revise the statement to, you are worthy and good because you are you. Right? So we've taken away agency, worthiness, adequacy from people by making them receptors of gifts that are bestowed upon them in education. And we've translated that training into the corporate structure so that people are not aligned and they are not engaged. My friend Andres Marquez, he has an organization called You Facilitate, and he provides trainings and meeting facilitation for companies to promote alignment and engagement. He understands how to capitalize on design thinking and empathy in corporations in a way that can undo some of the disempowerment that people have brought from education and society into the corporate world.
What a powerful gift that feedback has been. I am so going to deploy. I'm really going to take that on, and I'm going to send you a message when the term is over and let you know how the new sentence goes. That was really great feedback. Okay, so I have a final question that I ask all my guests. That's where we're going. But before I do, let me just ask, was there anything that you wanted to share that we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about that maybe is on your mind, or something you maybe wanted to talk about before you even got on the call?
So this has been terrific. You're a great interviewer. I loved everything that you brought into the conversation. And I feel like all the fabulous ground that there is to cover in an hour could be covered. Of course, it's a dense and meaty topic that it just pulls from so many different directions. And it's been an honor and a delight to explore this far with you.
Oh, well, thank you. I wasn't looking for positive feedback, but I will take it. Dr. Gray, the last question I'll ask today, I ask of all my guests, is if you can think of a time in your personal life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
So it was a personal professional experience with Edwin Rutch. And yeah, we spent hours together for months and months and months practicing empathy circles and learning design thinking, not only the two of us, but the two of us with other professionals and with the students in the Connect Group school. And it was Edwin's conveyance to me about empathy through, it's just a reminder of Carl Rogers' empathy circle, which of course every therapist, every mental health clinician learns humanistic, client-centered therapy, how to be empathic, how to listen. But the practices with Edwin really deepened my understanding of empathy, my understanding of myself, our practice of design thinking, the way I learned it from him. It was empathy to have so many empathy circles with him. We would do it for 3 hours at a time, hours and hours and hours. And so that was really healing and transformational, both personally and professionally. So shout out to Edwin Rutch.
I was going to say, since you've given him a plug, can you just, as a final thing, explain what an empathy circle is technically, so people who might be interested in learning to be a facilitator or taking part can get hooked by you?
So empathy circles is a technique where it could be in a circle of 3 or 4 people or a dyad, and one person is the listener and another person is the speaker. And then if there's 3 and 4 people in the group, then 2 are observers. And while the speaker is speaking, the listener is just listening. And when the speaker pauses, the listener returns to the speaker what they heard them say. And it's without judgment, without commentary, without add-ons. And it gives the speaker an opportunity to hear what they've said and to either correct the listener and say, you didn't hear it right, I really meant like this, or to recognize that they didn't say what they meant. And then after going through a few rounds until the speaker feels like they've been fully heard, at which point the listener becomes the speaker and then selects somebody else, or in a dyad, the speaker. So Edwin does a much better job explaining it, but it's something like that.
Well, I've done it too. I know Edwin very well and love his work. So I'm so glad you brought this up. It is very difficult. It takes a lot of cognitive strength to listen, to hold space, and we have to become better listeners. That is a skill that I think we should, as humans, develop, and it would go a long way.
It takes a lot of self-discipline to put one's inner life aside and fully pay attention to the speaker. And that's the beauty of self-compassion and self-empathy, is that it's like making an appointment with yourself to tune in so that you don't have to do it in dialogue with someone else.
Incredible. Oh, I have loved this conversation. I'm sure people who are listening and watching have loved this conversation. I might ask you to consider sharing some of your favorite resources so that I can put them in the show notes, include yours, obviously. Thank you for making the time today. It's been a pleasure to spend this hour, and I hope we meet in person at some point.
Likewise, it's been an honor and a pleasure for me. And thank you so much for everything you do to promote empathy. It's a real gift to the world.
Oh, with that, we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. Thanks so much for watching this episode, and I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel, Purposeful Empathy is devoted to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. You've just done something about it by watching the show. Again, subscribe if you can, and consider picking up a copy today.